I thought today I'd talk to you about the nature of reality, especially interdimensional travel, the multi-universe, and other such things. To understand these is absolutely essential if you want to know about UFOs, ghosts, paranormal events generally. Because what you have to accept before you do any kind of understanding of these phenomena is that the human view of reality is fundamentally flawed. We see everything from a subjective point of view, and each of us, we have a brain which constructs a 3D model of what's around us. But we've got a slight problem. In fact, we've got a very major problem, and that is that our senses, frankly, aren't that good. Of the total light spectrum, we're capable of perceiving about 4 to 5%. In other words, we're 95% blind. And the same goes for our other senses. Hearing, for instance, we all know that our hearing is very poor compared to a dog or a cat or other animals. Likewise for night vision. Put us in a dark space and we're virtually blind. We can't see a thing. Dogs, on the other hand, you'll know that if you've got a dog or you've ever had a dog, they go outside and they can see perfectly well in the dark. They can run around and stuff like that and chase about in a pitch black forest and never run into anything. So this model that we've all got in our heads is exactly that. It's largely a fake. It's inaccurate and it's certainly incomplete. So when we say, oh, I saw it with my own eyes, I saw this and I saw that, well, you haven't. Your brain has made a 3D model of what it thinks it's seen based on the limited information it's got at its disposal. And there's a lot of information that suggests that when your brain doesn't have enough information, well, it simply guesses and makes it up. But when it presents it to you, it all looks very real and very deeply based in reality. When in fact, it's anything but. So where does the interdimensional aspect of our reality come into this? The true nature of what's actually going on around us. To put it simply, I often try to explain to people in a simplistic terms, because that's all I understand. That imagine that life is like a huge onion. And we all know that when we cut an onion up, there's various skins that come off it in sections. Little rings of the onion keep peeling off. Well, that's what interdimensional travel's like. That's the way that other dimensions are formed. Where we are now, that we call reality, right next door to us, there's another dimension where things are slightly different. And the further you go away from your own dimension, the one that we're in now, the stranger things get. So initially, if you went into the next dimension tier, you'd hardly notice a difference. In fact, I'd be as bold to suggest that all of us from time to time go into many different directions and many different dimensions. And our life experiences there may well be different. Like, for instance, if you drop into a dimension where things tend to be negative, to us it looks like the same place as we've just come from. We've not even realised that we've moved anywhere. But things look slightly different. Just little details are slightly different to what we're used to. Perhaps people that you know have started acting differently to what they normally behave. They've changed somehow. Very slightly sometimes quite in a big way. And you might well exist in this dimension for a few days and then fall back into your normal dimension and things return to normal. We've all had that experience of waking up one morning and things suddenly don't feel the same. You can't put your finger on it, but things seem to be different somehow. You don't feel as if you belong where you are at the moment. And of course, we all put that down to, oh, you're feeling a bit down in the dumps, or you're feeling depressed, or whatever it is. But it could be that you've actually slipped into another dimension without even realising it. And because the dimension is right next door to you, where you are at the moment, you don't even notice the difference. This might account for why people's lives suddenly take on a very negative aspect. We all know people, it might have happened to you yourself, where you reach a point in your life where everything just seems to go wrong. And it doesn't matter how much you try, you seem to have got a curse on you where everything's going wrong. And this might happen for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a couple of years. And then slowly but surely, you slip back into another dimension, the original one that you came from, and things seemingly get back to normal. And people say, oh, I went through a bad patch. A bad patch? What does that mean? If events are random, as some people will tell you, there's no such thing as a bad patch, because you'd get an equal amount of good things happening to you as bad. So if you go into a bad patch, there's something wrong, because that doesn't fit science. So there's another explanation to this. There's something wrong somewhere. Now, what happens is the further you get away in these various dimensions from where you are at the moment, the stranger life becomes. At first, you hardly notice any difference. It's the same people, the same places, your same family, the same things, your same job. But as you get further and further away, you'll notice that there are different things happening, and the differences stop being subtle. They will be very big differences. You could have a completely different life, for instance. But of course, you've probably never been to that dimension, so you've never experienced it. But those dimensions could be opened up every time you make a decision. For instance, the decision to not change that job, take that job you were offered. Suddenly you've opened up another dimension by staying where you are. If you do take the job, that opens up another dimension and you go off on a different path. It's a bit like a train when it's going down a track. And it gets to the points, and the signalman throws the points, and the train goes one way towards its destination. And along a long journey, say in the United Kingdom, from let's just say London to Scotland, there'll be lots of little points, lots of little signalmen, all throwing the points and sending them in the right direction. And maybe our lives are like that. But every time they throw the points and we go into a different direction, we actually go into another dimension. And that might be a dimension where everything's very positive and everything works out for you. Or it might be a dimension where it doesn't matter what you try, everything goes wrong. And I'm sure everybody has this same feeling. From time to time, you just can't do right for doing wrong. And it doesn't matter how much you try, it seems to blow up in your face. And that could be because you've gone into another dimension without even realising it. Now what we find, if we could travel through these dimensions, if we had got some kind of craft that we could get in and move through these dimensions, at first we'd hardly notice any change. Life would appear to be exactly the same. The human beings there, people you know would be there. Everything will look the same. But as you go further and further out, in other words, you go through more of the skins of the onion, as it were, things start to change quite dramatically. And if you went through a lot of different dimensions, you get to places that you wouldn't even recognise. This is a whole new place. Different creatures, different animals, different landscapes. In fact, it looks like a different planet. Now it could be, just could be, that on some of these other dimensions, people have discovered how to travel from one dimension to another, but not only through one, but through all dimensions to anywhere they want. In other words, they found the secret of interdimensional travel. Now, if beings got into a little craft and travelled through other dimensions and came into ours, we might well look at them, those people who were lucky enough to see them. And if they saw their craft, they might think, that's a UFO. It's not one of ours, and it's doing things that we can't do. It's a UFO. And people think it's come from some far-off galaxy. In reality, it's probably just come from another dimension. And if we were lucky enough to see the occupants of these craft, and you were startled by them, it's probably because they don't look anything like us. And yet they could be the occupants of Earth from another dimension. The other thing about interdimensional travel is that once you've discovered how to use it, you can also move in time, because different dimensions have different times to them. So you can use your little craft, your own private little UFO, as it were, to travel to any time, to any place in the universe, and to any other dimension. What a journey that would be. You could just pop along to some time in history, study what's going on, and then come back. One of the funny things about the alien abduction scenario is something that's little reported, but it does crop up in a few books and stuff like that, the occasional documentary, where people who've been abducted say that they've been abducted from childhood, and they might be my age by this time, getting on to be quite old. And the strange thing is, there might be several years go by between these various abductions, certainly several months. And the strange thing they report is that one of the aliens is always the same one. In fact, they're quite sure that all of them are the same as the ones that have abducted them before, and before that, and before that, and before that. Of course, if you can travel in time, then within the space of what we would call a day, if you'd got your little private interdimensional spacecraft, you could travel to the same person when they were 5 years old, when they were 6 years old, when they were 7 years old, and so on. And you could do that in a relatively short time, over the space of a few days, using the same people, or the same beings, same individuals, the same craft, everything. And yet to the person who's been abducted, of course, years, months, or even years have gone past, even decades have gone past. And yet it's the same ones turning up each time. But that's because they're in a different time continuum to what you are. They can jump through time whenever it suits them. You can't. Because to us, in our little world, time is linear. It moves along at its own pace. And we start off young and we get old. And we have a life in between. But what if you had a craft that could travel in time and travel to any place that you wanted? Any other dimension? I also think that there's a dimension or dimensions where the souls of the dead go. So everybody that we know who's passed, their soul has gone to another dimension. And it could be that they exist as energy beings, for instance, which don't have a physical form as such, certainly not a human form. So that's a place that we would find very strange. But perhaps that's the destiny for all of us, ultimately. To find this place, and people call it heaven. Strange that one of the things that most of the religions agree on is that when we die, our soul goes to heaven or something with an equivalent name. It's strange, isn't it, that all the religions have got this one common factor. They argue about everything else, but what happens when we die, they seem to agree on, which is interesting to say the least. So when we're talking about ghosts, for instance, those might be souls that are trapped between dimensions and are suddenly trapped somewhere, and that's why they're manifesting in our dimension in a place where they shouldn't be. So startled onlookers suddenly see something that doesn't fit, shouldn't be there, and of course that then disappears and goes away. And these people cannot prove what they've seen. They can talk to people and give them their story, but who's going to believe them without physical evidence? And this comes to something which a lot of people are interested in, is that there are haunted places, so-called, around the world. We all know about ancient cultures that had what they call badlands, or ghost areas, haunted places, places where evil beings were. And the elders of the tribes long ago would tell their young people, don't go near that certain place because it's haunted, it's cursed, or whatever it is. And if people are foolish enough to go there, they may well see a very strange being indeed, and be extremely frightened by what they've seen. So what's going on there? People ask me. Well, it could be that the dimensions are kept apart by a force that we don't know about. It's like a curtain, if you like, from one side of a dimension to another, so that we don't keep falling into other dimensions all the time, because that would be chaos. But it could be at various places around the world because of certain factors, some of which are geographical. These barriers, these curtains, if you like, are thinner than normal, or maybe there's a gap. And that then becomes what people refer to as a portal to other dimensions. So strange beings can pop in to our reality, our dimension, and be witnessed by startled onlookers who can't understand what they're seeing. And likewise, just as chilling, we could fall into another dimension and be never seen again. Surprising as it may seem, this happens an awful lot. There are a lot of people reported missing every year who never turn up, ever. No body, no trace of them, no belongings are ever found. They just simply disappear. Now this could be dismissed, and often is, that the person has staged their own disappearance for whatever reason, personal reasons, breakdown, whatever it is. But it could also be that they've accidentally fallen into a dimension that they can't escape from. And I've seen stuff about, for instance, the Skinwalker Ranch, which is a very famous place where lots of strange things occur. And there's been documentaries made. There's one running at the moment, a series running at the moment, where they're investigating this thing. And this isn't like some people would have you believe, that it's just people imagining things and whatever. There's something seriously going on there. And there's been a lot of money spent looking into this. And it's no coincidence that if you're looking at paranormal, they've got a full house there. They've got ghosts, apparitions, strange creatures, apparently creatures that don't belong in this time zone, dinosaurs, ancient huge creatures that are now extinct, that once lived on our world. We know that from fossils, but they're now extinct, and yet people see them there. UFOs appear, apparently from nowhere, and I know people who have seen stuff like that. I was talking to somebody who I got quite friendly with actually, and he's written several books. He was telling me about a time when he was in Sheffield late at night. He was taking his dog for a walk with his then girlfriend, who's now his wife of some considerable years now, because the gentleman in question is quite elderly now. But this happened in the late 60s. And he was walking near a park in the middle of the city. And suddenly he saw this ball of light in front of him. And he said it was about the size of a football or soccer ball for you Americans, held at arm's length. It wasn't the moon. He knew what the moon looked like because he was a police officer who used to regularly walk around on nights. So he was very familiar with being out at night. So he wasn't going to be kidded by anything like that. And he was looking at this object, and he got the feeling, he said, that he was being watched. His dog became absolutely hysterical and physically broke the lead that he was on and ran back to the house. And when they went back, they found him outside the front door, quivering still. He was extremely frightened. Again, this is a phenomenon that's often witnessed where there are animals, or particularly dogs, involved. The animals are terrified by UFOs, their occupants, and other things like this. Anyway, this guy I know was watching this ball of light when suddenly it just disappeared into nothing. It didn't fly off in any direction, up, down, to the side, anywhere. He said it went from a ball like that and just went like that into a tiny little spot. And he likened it to the old-fashioned televisions that used to have valves. I can remember them from my childhood. When you switched them off, they didn't just go off altogether like they do now. The picture just went down to infinity, to a little dot. And he said it was just like that. And this thing literally disappeared in front of his eyes. The strange thing was that when he went home, he wasn't actually living with his girlfriend, and they went back to the girlfriend's house. And he went back home and then decided to go to the local newspaper. By this time, it's sort of 12 o'clock at night. So I went down to the local newspaper and spoke to the night editor, who we didn't know, and this editor didn't know him. And he asked if people had seen any funny lights. And the editor says, yeah, we've been getting phone calls from all over Sheffield. People reporting seeing strange things in the air, flying through the air. At which point he left. Didn't leave his name or anything like that. The following morning, when he went reported for duty, he was summoned into the chief inspector's office, and he said that was like seeing God. Normally, as an ordinary police constable, he would never see the chief inspector unless he was in big trouble. And he went in, and this chief inspector said to him, there's two gentlemen here from London. They wish to speak to you about what you saw last night. Now, a couple of questions. How the hell did he know what he'd seen? Because he hadn't told anybody. Nobody at the newspaper recognised him. He didn't recognise anybody from there. So how did they know in such a quick time that he'd been down to the newspaper and that he'd reported or asked about strange aerial phenomena? The second thing he found unusual were these two fellas who looked like sort of executive civil servants had got to Sheffield very quickly. In those days, travel was not as quick as it is now, and they'd got there in a matter of a few hours. And they seemed to know an awful lot more than they should have known. They asked to go with him, and he was told basically by the chief inspector to be at these guys' disposal continuously until they said otherwise. So these guys from whatever ministry it was, or whoever they were, had obviously got a lot of clout because they got full use of this guy for as long as they wanted. So anyway, cut a long story short, they went to the scene. He described what he'd seen. They just wrote it all down, asked him questions. Interestingly, they never interviewed his girlfriend who was there at the time with him. And then after about 2 days of questioning and going to different places and explaining things again and again and again, he was made to go to a local court at about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. Clearly it had been opened specially, and there was a judge there. He was made to swear an oath on the Bible that he would not disclose this information for another 30 years because it was presumably top secret. And with that, these two gentlemen from London said they were leaving. But before they left, the police officer said to him, the one who seemed to be in charge, said to him, "Excuse me, sir, can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Yes, sir, go ahead." He says, "You know that thing that I saw? Was it a flying saucer, these spaceships that they're talking about?" And he turned around to him and says, "Yes, it is, but you can't tell anybody." And with that, they disappeared. Now, interestingly, something similar happened to me when I was a child. I'd be about maybe 12 or 13. And one day, I was at school and we were in metalwork. And there were about 20 boys there because it was only boys in those days that did metalwork. And suddenly one of the lads just fainted. No big deal, and people used to faint now and again, kids do. But before anybody could grab hold of him, somebody else did. And then another one, then another one, and then another one. After about 30 seconds, a minute, the only two people who were still standing was the teacher and me. Nobody else. All the lads were literally spark out on the floor. Now, this teacher was known to be not a particularly pleasant person. Everybody was scared of him. He's a bit of a wild man, to be honest. This guy was absolutely panic-stricken. He'd obviously never seen anything like this in his life before. And he was almost grey. You know, when somebody goes grey, that colour, where they're so upset and so frightened by something, they literally go grey. And he was just frozen with fear. He didn't know what to do. So I said, "I'll run and get help." And he went, "Yes, good idea, Dennis." So I shot out the door and I ran up to the staff room. And as I was going, if I saw any teachers, I was telling them what's going on. And they went running down. I went to the staff room, gathered up all the staff members who were there. And the next thing, we're all back down to the metal workshop. By this time, these boys had been literally carried out of the metalwork room, and laid on a bank nearby to recover. Some of them was just starting to come round and still a bit groggy and stuff. And the teacher was there explaining to his colleagues what had happened and all the rest of it. And everybody's very mystified. Of course, the conclusion that everybody jumped to, with it being a metal workshop, was that it was probably some kind of gas or something like that, because they had furnaces and stuff like that going, and all sorts of equipment in there, oxyacetylene welding equipment and stuff like that, who knows what. So the obvious conclusion to jump to was that it was some kind of gas escape and everybody being overcome. But then staff members particularly, started asking me, "Are you all right, Dennis?" And I said, "Yeah, fine." I had no ill effects at all. Didn't feel lightheaded, nothing. And they were joking with me about, I remember one of them said, "Have you got gills or something, And I thought, that's strange, isn't it? Anyway, the boys all came round, and of course in those days we didn't have the nanny state, so they weren't whizzed off to hospital and a big fuss made. As far as the staff were concerned, these boys had just fainted and whatever, and they went, within minutes they were back in class and completed the day as normal. I think things are a bit different now, I think there'd be a fleet of ambulances and helicopters arriving and all sorts now But in those days, we didn't mess about with things like that. People just got on with stuff. Bit different today. Anyway, a couple of days later, somebody came and pulled me out of one of the lessons I was in and said, "Oh, can you come down to this office?" I think it was the deputy heads. And I went into this office with this one of the secretaries who brought me out, and she introduced me to these two men, but she didn't say who they were. There was actually three of them and her boss with them, so there was three men in total. Two of them I was immediately introduced to, and the other one was already in the office, so I didn't know he was there. So I introduced these two men, who then took me into the office, and their boss was there waiting, and they sat me down. And at first they started talking about football and what team do you support and what do you like watching on television and blah, 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 blah. And they said, what are you interested in, Dennis? What do you like doing? What do you read at home and stuff like that? And I said, well, I like books about dinosaurs, which I did, like a lot of little boys do. Love dinosaurs. And I was mad keen on the space program that was going on at the time, which was the Apollo. And it was a big deal in the early 70s and stuff, because it was on television all the time and all the moon landings and stuff. So I was very interested in that, and I'm very interested in astronomy and stuff as well. And one of the guys said to me, "Do you believe in UFOs?" I said, "Oh yeah." And he said, "What do you think they are?" I said, "Well, to be honest, I don't really know, but I think they obviously come from somewhere different to here. But I do believe in them. I think they're absolutely true." Now, in those days, the early 70s, the UFO phenomenon was not like it is now, where everybody knows about it. You can put the internet on. There's a million websites about it, loads of YouTube videos and everything. In the 70s, it was hardly ever referred to on television. There were one or two books about it, but basically it was very fringe. And as soon as we started talking about UFOs, the gentleman who was obviously in charge, I guessed that because he was older and he was better dressed. In fact, to be honest, he reminded me a bit of John Steed out of the Avengers. Very dapper. And he was also very well spoken. I could tell he was wouldn't surprise me if he was an old Etonian or something like that. And as soon as we started talking about UFOs, and I answered in the affirmative, he came forward, and as if on a cue, these two other guys parted, and one of them sat in his chair and one of them stood up, and suddenly the John Steed character takes up the interview. Now, looking back, I obviously realised now that the first two were kind of softening me up. And then when they got to the nitty-gritty, the more senior man was to come forward and carry on, and that's what he did. Started asking me about UFOs. Where do you think they come from? Who do you think they are? What do you think they look like? And then he started saying things to me about, have you ever seen one? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, have you ever been taken away in the night? And I said, no, not as far as I know. I've never experienced it, but I know they're here. Because I had contact of some description since I was a child. Somehow I knew that there was something following me all the time. I even felt, as a very small child, even when I was in the sort of infant school, I felt that everything that my eyes saw was being kind of recorded and then downloaded in some way, and somebody else was watching. It's a strange thing for a 5 or 6 year old child to think, particularly before all the technology came along that we've got today. Don't forget, this was in the 1960s, and the events I'm relating to were in the early 70s, about 1971, 72, something like that. Anyway, these strange thing was that these people from these three men I assumed they were from the education department, but looking back now, I don't think they actually were. I think they were one of the, shall we say, more secretive branches of the civil service. And they'd obviously come to speak to me because they'd found out about this mass fainting. And a number of years later, I was reading about this in a magazine called The Unexplained, about mass faintings, and other people relating that they'd been involved, and that strange people from unexplained ministries used to turn up and start interrogating about what had happened, and also linking it to UFOs and stuff like that. So it appears that at least the authorities think that these phenomena are linked in some way. And it could be that because of my, shall we say, experiences with some of these beings, that's why I wasn't affected. Of course, other people might have a different opinion. That's up to them. But that's the opinion I came to over the years, having researched a lot of these things. And when I was a child, I was always very frightened of the dark. And that stayed with me right into adulthood. And then one morning, let me backtrack a little bit. Strange things used to happen to me. I'd go to bed wearing a t-shirt and I'd wake up in the morning and it was inside out. I'd go to bed and wake up in the morning and the sheets were the wrong way around. For instance, the continental quilt was underneath and the bed sheet was on top. So unless I'm sort of sleepwalking and making beds and changing things, there's something strange happening. And this used to happen to me a lot. Weird things. And also if people stopped at my house, they'd report strange things as well. And in later weeks and days, that would follow them back to where they live. So I was always pretty scared of being on my own in a house, which is strange because most of the time I've lived on my own. I was also scared of the dark. I didn't like having all the lights off at night. I'd quite often leave a landing light on all night. Not uncommon for me to do that. And then when I was about 40 or in my early 40s, I suddenly woke up one morning and I just knew that they weren't coming again. And that the reason that they weren't coming was they told me that I was too old for whatever the purpose they got. And from that moment onwards, I've never been scared of the dark since. I can walk around in a totally dark house now and I couldn't care less. And that was the strange phenomenon. And the funny thing was that when I realised this, that they weren't coming again, I was a bit sad. I was sort of thinking, I've got a feeling of, a friend going. And what made me wonder, and I've said this to other people, this phenomena where the same alien apparently turns up over the years. It could be that alien is actually yourself from a different dimension. Because after all, if you could travel into a different dimension where a version of yourself existed in a different form, that would be the alien, in quotation marks, that you'd be most interested in. So I wonder if when people are being abducted, they're actually being abducted by themselves, but in a different form and from a different reality, a different dimension to the one that they have now. So it could be that I exist in this form because I'm in this dimension, but equally I could also exist in several other dimensions, some of which are where I am now, similar to exactly the same as what I am now, very similar places, but different lives, where you're living a different life. But in some dimensions, I exist as something entirely different that I wouldn't even recognise. And maybe we all do. Maybe that's what happens. But some of these interdimensional beings have found a way of unlocking the door and coming into ours. Now, what we've noticed recently has been a huge upsurge of UFO activity, paranormal activity. And I've said this publicly myself many times, that the reason for this is because we're not far away from getting the keys to the interdimensional door. And these beings from other dimensions have been monitoring us, and they don't like what they see, because this is not a nice world. And human beings do not particularly treat each other particularly nicely. And if you don't believe me, just turn on the TV news. So possibly these beings from other dimensions aren't exactly pleased with the prospect of us dropping in on them unexpectedly and bringing all our violence, anger and hatred with us. So possibly they're monitoring us and stopping us from developing this technology until we've grown up a little bit. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're abducting people and then using those people as a conduit to put their message through. And I've noticed this myself quite often. I'll wake up in the morning with I've got an urgent message that I've got to tell people. I've had this many, many times. And these messages have always been correct. People have been abducted, like myself, report that they seem to have additional powers granted to them. For instance, I can remote view, and I have done for a long time. And here's a little secret for you. I've helped law enforcement around the world with their cases as a remote viewer. Of course, they don't tell you that because everybody will laugh and they'll get the funding cut and whoever's responsible will get fired. So we used to do it through a third-party agency, which was actually run by an ex-FBI agent. And we used to spend our time, when I say we, there was about 20 of us. Some were remote viewers, some were psychics, all sorts of different people with, if you like, paranormal abilities. And we'd get cases down, things like a missing aircraft, for instance. The authorities have searched for it, can't find any trace. In America, this happens a lot because there's a lot of places in America where there's absolutely nothing for miles and miles and miles. It's hard for us in Britain to understand that, because if a plane crashed in Britain, somebody'd find it within 2 minutes. Somebody'd see it, somebody'd see the smoke or whatever it is. But in America, not so. A light aircraft, for instance, can crash and it just disappears. And nobody finds it until 3, 4, 5, 10 years later. A hiker's out there in the middle of nowhere and comes across the wreckage. This happens all too often in America. And that's what we were doing. And we were brought in usually when the normal searches, normal in quotation marks, had fallen down and stopped happening. And we were brought in at that point and we got some good results. But I'll tell you about that another time.